Il y a une tension sociale.
Special political situation.
Yes, we've been in government, we've been in opposition, like...
We need the truth to restore trust.
My name is George Simeon.
I wish to remember all of you.
Ce fac eu?
Nu cu mine, nu fac nimic.
Cum am ajuns aici?
Vladimir Kara-Murza, political activist, journalist, author, filmmaker and former political prisoner. You're a key figure for contemporary history, so thank you for this dialogue.
Thank you so much for your invitation.
I couldn't help but notice that you're being guarded. It might seem a silly question, but why do you need to be guarded?
That's a question should be addressed to the government of Romania. I'm very grateful for the security detail, but it was not my initiative. It was the decision by the government of Romania.
Do you ever feel in danger while traveling across Europe, or?
I try not to think about this, because if you do, you become paranoid, and that's not the route I want to go. Look, I've been twice poisoned by the Russian security services. I was sent to Siberia with a 25-year prison sentence where they could kill me every single day in that solitary confinement. You sort of learn to live with this, and you put it to the back of your head, because if you spend your whole day, your whole life, just going around worried about this, you're just going to be paralyzed and you won't be able to do anything else. And I have a lot of things that I need to do, so that thought is placed firmly in the back of my mind, and it stays there.
Unfortunately, you, as you say, you've had some experience with Russian force, but I want to put your experience more to the benefit of the Romanian public. We've been to an electoral campaign in which the theme of Russian influence was a constant. However, there are many people who consider this to be a secondary issue. Do you have a message for them?
Well, no democracy is safe when the KGB tries to put its hands into it. We know from the communist time, from the Soviet era, that the state security in the Soviet Union, under its various names, the NKVD, the MGB, the KGB, and so on, has not only repressed our own people inside the country, but they've also tried to influence and shape and get themselves into the political lives of other countries, most of all the democracies of the West. We know from the archives that were partially, unfortunately only partially, but still declassified in the 1990s after the collapse of the Soviet regime, just how extensive this involvement by the Soviet security services was. They used to call it active measures. That was the term they used on their KGB professional jargon. They would try to plant stories in the Western newspapers. They would try to discredit politicians they did not like. They would try to help and push along politicians they did like, and so on. And they continue to do this now, except with a serious update on technology. If they could be so active and so effective at what they did back in the 1970s, just imagine what they can do today. With all the technologies, with the internet, with the social media, with everything, now with the news traveling around the planet literally in seconds. And we know for a fact that the current Kremlin regime under Vladimir Putin is actively involved in interfering in the sovereign affairs of other countries. We know that they actively support political forces in Western democracies. Usually it's either far right or the far left. It's the two extremes. So every time I go to testify at a hearing, for example, in a parliament of one of the EU countries, I always know that there'll be a deputy, a member of parliament, either from the far right or from the far left, who will stand up and just reproduce the talking points that you can hear on Russian state television every evening. And this is the same with Romania. It's no doubt for anyone that the Kremlin regime was actively rooting first for Mr. Georgescu and then for Mr. Simeon. And Alexander Dugin, one of the sort of main ideologists of the current Kremlin regime, has written about the fact that we already have a plan. Once Simeon is installed as president, we have many plans for Romania. Now, it was very important that Putin's candidate lost. I had a meeting with President-elect Nicuşor Dan here in Bucharest, and I started our conversation by congratulating him, because I said that your victory was important not only obviously for many people here in Romania, but also for a lot of people around the world who still believe in democracy and who still want to fight for democracy and who still want democracy to win over the forces that are fighting against democracy. And what happened here in Romania with this presidential election was very important and also very optimistic. It shows that despite all the influence and all the interference and all the help, let's put it that way, that these forces are getting from Mr. Putin's Kremlin, the forces of democracy are still able to prevail. That's a very optimistic lesson.
Did you hear those Russian key points here in Romania while staying here from anybody?
I have to say this forum is so busy that I haven't had a chance to listen to anything. I'm just at events from morning to evening at meetings. And here I'm meeting with normal people who would not repeat these points. I had, apart from the president-elect, I had several meetings at the Romanian Parliament. I also participated in the European Young Leaders Summit at the Palace of Parliament yesterday. And then, of course, the many panel lunches, events, meetings here at the Black Sea Security Forum and interviews like the one I'm giving now. So, no, thankfully I've been shelved from any pro-Kremlin talking points here in Romania. But I'm aware that they are very widespread, and not only here in Romania, but also in France, in Germany, in Austria, of course, in Hungary, where Mr. Orban, Vladimir Putin's best friend in the European Union. There's hardly a country in the West where the Kremlin regime is not trying to meddle in its domestic politics. And I can tell you, once the Putin regime is gone, and once all the archives are declassified, and next time they really will be declassified, we're not going to repeat the mistake that the previous generation made in the 1990s, where a lot of the Soviet archives were kept under seal. These archives really will be declassified. I think you'll find a lot of familiar names in those archives about people who are connected to the Kremlin in one way or another, including names from this country.
Well, this is a personal question. You travel to Romania, but you travel to every other country in Europe, across the world. Why do you do it? Do you feel like you have a responsibility?
Look, up until a few months ago, I was sitting in a solitary confinement cell at a maximum security prison in Siberia. I know what it's like to wake up every morning at 5 o'clock in a tiny cell, 2 by 3 meters, where you have just 4 walls and a small window with metal bars under the ceiling, where you have to attach your bunk to the wall at 5 o'clock, and then all you can do for the rest of the day is just to walk around in a small circle in a tiny cell. They only give you paper and pens to write for an hour and a half a day. They didn't allow me to call my wife or my kids. There's no one to talk to, there's nothing to do, there's nowhere to go. And this seems like this is what the rest of your life is going to look like. And I cannot even begin to describe the darkness, the blackness that you exist in this situation. Well, I and 15 others were saved by this miracle of the prisoner exchange that happened last summer, thanks to the US and German governments, the former US and German governments, I should add. But there are thousands of people, my fellow Russian citizens, who are still waking up at 5 in the morning, still walking around a small cell, still attaching their bunks to the wall, still are not able to communicate with their loved ones. And for many of these political prisoners in Russia, the situation is increasingly urgent. This is not only about unlawful and politically motivated and unjust imprisonment. It is actually about life or death. As it is, for example, for Alexei Gorinov, who's a Moscow municipal deputy, who, at the beginning of the full-scale war in Ukraine, came to his district council meeting in central Moscow and called for a minute of silence in memory of Ukrainian children who are being killed by Russian bombs. He received 7 years in prison for that. He's now on his way to eastern Siberia by prisoner transport, the infamous Stolypin carriages. He's in his 60s, he's missing a part of his lung, and he's just been diagnosed with tuberculosis. For him, this is a death sentence, and there are many people like him. And the answer to your question is we need to get these people out. And, you know, for many years, even before I was in prison myself, I engaged in advocacy on behalf of political prisoners because it is not okay in the 21st century, in a European country or in any country, to be locking people up just because they happen to disagree with the government. That's the reality of Putin's Russia today. But now I can feel it with my own skin, if you want. And so, yes, I wish more than anything that I would just settle down for quiet time with my family, with my wife and children. But there are so many people to save, there's so much to do. And yes, you were right to use the word responsibility. I do feel this responsibility. Because we were saved from that hell of Vladimir Putin's gulag, thanks to international advocacy on our behalf. Well, now I feel responsible for advocating for other people to make sure we save them too.
Yet there are people here that just can't understand what's happening, what you are describing right now. You were talking about the ideology, but can you describe how Russian influence looks like in a country where Putin has interests?
Well, there are things we already know. We do know, for example, that a few years ago, the Front National, the far-right party in France led by Marine Le Pen, received a multi-million euro loan from a Russian-connected bank. We do know that last year, I believe it was, one of the operatives in the Alternative für Deutschland, the far-right party in Germany, was exposed as a Russian government agent. We do know that the Kremlin propaganda machine is actively working to help with information messages, or I should say disinformation messages, these forces who are favorable to Putin and who are supported by Putin. But what we know now are just snippets of information. This is just a tiny tip of a very large iceberg. And once the Putin regime is gone, once all the archives are declassified and published, we will see a lot of interesting information about how these people operate. If there was money that was paid, I'm sure there was, and I think one day we'll know this. What the reasoning was, and all of the internal workings of this machinery, the internal workings of this mechanism. I mentioned already that in the 1990s, only a very small part of the Soviet-era communist archives were declassified. But even the tiny part that was, that had an enormous impact. For example, during the 1992 Constitutional Court case, when the Communist Party went to court against President Boris Elţîn, challenging his decree banning the Communist Party. During that Constitutional Court case, there were some documents from the former Communist Party Central Committee archive that were declassified and made public. And a lot of those documents actually had to do with Soviet foreign influence operations, with how they worked. And very often it would be just as mundane, as banal as literally paying money to people. For example, there was a document in that archive that was published in 1992 that showed that in 1984, during the British miners' strike against Margaret Thatcher's government, the Politburo authorized the payment of $1 million to those striking miners to make sure that they continue to protest against Thatcher. There was a document, an internal report from the Central Committee's International Affairs Bureau to the Politburo of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, describing the close mutual trust and collaboration between the communist regime in Moscow and Kalevi Sorsa, who was a long-time Prime Minister of Finland. At the time this document was published, Sorsa was still active in politics. He was in fact the leading candidate in the Finnish presidential election. And when that document was published, he had to step down in disgrace and leave politics and step down from the election campaign. Imagine what the impact would be if more documents were published. Next time we will sure to publish all the documents, and I think you will find a lot of interesting information there that concerns your country as well.
You're talking about the UK, about France, about Germany, but how should a country like Romania respond to this kind of Russian interference? Do you think we have a strong democratic system in order to fight back?
I think the strongest weapon here is transparency. The strongest weapon against propaganda and disinformation is the truth. And so it's really important to expose. Obviously we don't have the documents now, but there are still a lot of leads that can be found. There are still a lot of facts that can be disclosed. There's still a lot of information that can be published. And I think the most important, the most effective way to counter this dark behind-the-scenes influence, to counter these operations by Putin's regime, is to make sure people know about this. Because, you know, I imagine that no citizens in no country would be happy about some foreigners, whoever they are, coming in and, you know, trying to meddle and decide the outcome of your elections or trying to meddle in your domestic political life. And I believe the more people know about this, the more effective your defense will be against these types of active measures, to use the communist era jargon.
Why would Putin be so interested in Romania? I mean, particularly Romania?
Well, first of all, Putin's interested in any European Union and NATO country, any, because to him that's enemy territory, and he wants to try to, in his view, in his world mind, trying to undermine the enemy within, to weaken them. That's the reason he does this in all the countries that you mentioned, in Germany, in France, in the UK, in Austria, and so on. But don't forget that he's a Soviet KGB officer. I was about to say former Soviet KGB officer, but as they say themselves, there's no such thing as a former KGB officer. Once KGB, always KGB, and I believe this is absolutely true. Putin said openly many times that he views the peaceful dissolution of the Soviet Empire as, quote, the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. The 20th century, we're talking about a century that had 2 world wars, the Holocaust, and unimaginable crimes and horrors and crimes against humanity committed. But for him, the worst thing that happened was the peaceful dissolution of the Soviet Empire. In his mind, your country is still part of his sphere of influence. He still sees that map from 1988 with all the Warsaw Pact countries, with that line separating them from NATO countries. That's the world he still lives in.
There is this map at the Russian embassy in Bucharest. I've seen it.
I did not even know this, okay. But mentally they all live with this map. And so not only is Romania an EU country, a NATO country, but it is also a country that in Putin's lifetime was still part of the Soviet sphere of influence. So he's trying to do everything he can to recreate that sphere of influence. He's trying to do everything that he can to recreate that fallen empire. He's not going to be able to do this because there's a time for everything, and this is the 21st century. This is not a time for totalitarian empires. He's not going to be able to recreate the empire. He's not going to be able to stay in power forever. His regime will fall. But at what price this will be, at what price this already is, with all the deaths that have occurred during Putin's time in power and directly because of Putin's actions. This is the most important, most tragic question.
My last question, how do you see the future of US-EU relations in the context of Ukraine war, given that President Trump said on Friday that he will recommend to his cabinet the introduction of a 50% tariff on goods from the EU?
Well, for many, many years, many decades in fact, for the entirety of the Cold War and afterwards, the United States of America had this informal title, this informal mantle of the leader of the free world. I think it is beyond clear that under Mr. Trump's leadership, the United States of America has no right to this title anymore. Trump is openly siding with Putin over the war in Ukraine. He's openly courting dictators all over the world. He's effectively blaming Ukraine for this war when Ukraine was the one that was attacked by Putin. He is destroying, everything on which the United States foreign policy has been based for decades. He's already destroyed the whole system of international assistance for democracy and human rights. He is destroying the US international media systems that were so important for countries such as yours and mine during the Cold War, when so many people relied on these radio stations as the only source of objective and truthful information. And many people still do, for example, in my country, because there's no independent media in Russia. And Trump is destroying all of this. And I think if we look at the totality of everything that the current US administration has done in these past 4 years, it's only been 4 years. I mean, this is 5 years, 4 months, excuse me. It's only been 4 months. It's 5 years worth of news stories that have happened in this time. But to me, it's absolutely clear that the United States of America, under the leadership of Donald Trump, has no longer any right to this title of the leader of the free world. And I think it is very, very important that Europe, the European Union, stands up, stands tall, rises to the challenge, and takes on this title of leader of the free world. Because if there's still any hope for values and principles to be left in international affairs and international politics, that hope comes from this side of the Atlantic, not the other one.
Without any military support or military force?
Well, this is not only about hard power, a lot of it is about soft power. And actually, I was really heartened just a few days ago to hear the news that the European Union will be stepping up to create an emergency fund to try to keep afloat Radio Liberty, Radio Free Europe, which thankfully is based in Prague, not in America, so they cannot physically shut it down, they can just deny it funding. And we see Europeans stepping up and taking care of that. We know that, for all these 3+ years of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, if you take all the European countries' assistance together, it was actually more than American assistance to Ukraine. And so I believe what's most important here is that, we see this difference very clearly. For Mr. Trump and the US, it's all about expediency, it's all about gain, it's all about benefit, it's all about realpolitik. And I would like to believe that here on this side of the Atlantic in Europe, there is still place for principles and values in foreign affairs and international policy. And if we can hope for these principles and values to still hold a place, that hope lies in Europe.
Mr. Kara-Murza, thank you for this dialogue.
Thank you so much for your invitation.